Thank you, Michelle. I am honored to introduce Noah Charney to you tonight. Noah Charney is a professor of art history at both the American University of Rome and the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. Specializing in art crime, Charney is the founder and president of the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art, a nonprofit research group for issues in art crime. His expertise has led to regular television appearances, fascinating podcasts and articles, popular TED Talks, and of course, 12 best-selling books. From Charney's 2015 work, The Art of Forgery, to his 2017 Collector of Lives, Giorgio Vasari and the Invention of Art, this Pulitzer-nominated author drops the reader right into the heart of exhilarating art stories. Charney's most recent work, The Museum of Lost Art, vividly recounts tales of lost masterpieces. According to the Times, Noah Charney curates a collection of masterpieces that, destroyed, misplaced, or stolen, may no longer be seen. Yet they play a crucial role in our culture. Charney explores famous art that has been stolen, new works that have been rediscovered, and legendary pieces that remain rumors. New revelations about lost works reshape our understanding of art history. While Charney's scholarship is unmatched, he still manages to make dense techniques and histories accessible and exciting. The stories are, at different moments, humorous, heartbreaking, and almost inconceivable. I want to share two aspects of Charney's work that particularly surprised me. First, I initially considered art crimes to be relatively uncommon in our modern age of advanced technology. I was shocked by how much recent art theft and destruction has occurred during our lifetimes. Secondly, Charney deconstructs the idea that art theft is solely a white-collar crime. He does share the romanticized stories of gentleman criminals like Adam Worth, but goes further to expose the interwoven relationship of art theft with arms trade, drug trafficking, and international conflict. Charney engages the reader in the repercussions which ripple out from vivid tales of loss. It is fitting to have Charney here at the Dallas Museum of Art, since the Museum of Lost Art emphasizes the importance of considering works that have been overlooked because, in Charney's words, they lost the historical roll of the dice. As he further explains, our museums are full of treasures, and it is a small miracle that so much has survived. Highlighting what has been lost helps us to contextualize the value of the works that do exist. Ultimately, Charney sheds light on the impressions left upon blank walls and empty niches, asking us to learn from what we have lost and imagine what we might regain in the future. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Noah Charney.
Thank you so much all for coming out. That was the best introduction I think I've ever had. I'll be a tough act to follow after that. I ate at Lockhart's. Was that a good plan? Yeah? Okay. Because it's a tough call. Pecan Lodge is supposed to be really good too. We did our research. Book tours for me are a chance to eat things that we don't get over in Slovenia. Am I your first speaker living in Slovenia? I said, take me anywhere except Slovenian restaurants. And I know Dallas is full of them, but we managed to find a good option. I want you to imagine a museum of lost art and what it might look like. It would be larger than all of the museums of the world combined. It would have masterpieces from all different periods and by all the famous artists whose names you're familiar with, but with works of art that you may have never heard of and almost certainly have never seen. And I'm going to take you tonight through, well, before I get too excited, the title of this, maybe it sounds funny to you, The Treasure Hunter's Guide to Lost Art, but This book and the concept of looking at the history of works of art that are no longer extant, that we can no longer access, and that may have been lost forever, is potentially kind of a bummer. But I want to focus on the positive, and so I'm going to primarily look at works tonight that are almost certainly still out there. So if you feel like you want to get your Indiana Jones on, then you can keep an eye out for these. Some of the works that we might consider, I'm going to take you on a little guided tour. It's always hard for me to choose because there's too many good case studies, and I want to give you all of them. But I'm going to take you on some of the greatest hits, and I want to emphasize the scale of what's been lost. For most artists prior to the modern era, we know of far more art that existed than remains extant. And we're going to have a little extra vocabulary for you tonight. Extant in art terms means we know where the location is. Doesn't mean we can access it. It might be in a private collection, but we know that it still exists. It's accounted for. The opposite of extant is lost. And I like that term because lost can mean that it's been lost forever. Lost can mean that we are concerned that it's been lost forever, but we don't know. It could mean that it's been stolen, mislabeled, mislaid. It's sort of a catch-all, but it sounds like it could potentially be found again. And there are many stories of works that were almost miraculously rediscovered. And a few examples, the one behind me now. This is a parallel. I just did a great tour. Who gave the tour just before the talk? This is a really good tour. And the church painting, that's one of the highlights of this collection, has a similar story to this one. Uh-oh, get back there. I'm kind of technologically inept, so I make these PowerPoints that are supposed to magically show you exactly what I want on time, and it doesn't always work. The thing that's going to come up in just a second, the Caravaggio's Taking of Christ, is one of his most important paintings. Depending on which scholar you ask, there are around 40 extant Caravaggio paintings, and there are between 8 and 115 that are lost. Why that big number? Well, art history is very much an inexact science. There's a little bit of mysticism to it. There's a lot of opinion of scholars, and different scholars will have different views as to which is an authentic Caravaggio and which isn't. But it gives you a sense of scale of what's missing. And this one that's about to come up now, The Taking of Christ, was hanging in a dusty, dark corner of a Jesuit seminary in Dublin for certainly decades, possibly longer, and nobody noticed it. It sort of blended into the background, as the church painting did, I just learned, for a long time before it was sold, and then once it was on the market, people realized what it was. Well, it was until Caravaggio scholar Roberto Longhi accidentally stumbled on this, following a lead that somebody thought this might have been by one of Caravaggio's followers. He saw this, and he got this vibe that we associate with connoisseurship, which is the term for an innate understanding of an artist's oeuvre. The way you might recognize a relative from across the room, you just get this kind of vibe when you see a work of art, and you feel like it might be authentic by an artist whose work you know integrally. And that also sounds kind of mystical and new agey, and it is, because it's not the most scientific approach. But then we turn to provenance research, which is the documented history of objects, to determine the ownership history, make sure the object wasn't stolen, make sure that it is unlikely to be a forgery or a fake, but also to learn about which artworks we might be looking for because they're referred to in archival material, but we don't know where they are. And that's the story of this piece behind me now, which you probably recognize because it made a lot of headlines in December. This is Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, which around the 1950s sold for about 45 pounds, and in December sold for $450 million. So that's a pretty good investment. And it made headlines because it's the world's most expensive artwork at the moment. And this is a work that was a lost work by Leonardo, but one that we didn't know about. We didn't have specific references to it in archival documents that gave us a sense of the description of it to know what to look for if in the unlikely event that it should resurface. So when this was for sale in the 1950s, people thought it was sort of a 19th century work in the style of Leonardo, but it was dirty. It had to be cleaned and restored. And then, well, what do we do to make sure that it's the real deal? It goes to the conservators. And after connoisseurs say this looks like the real thing, and then they argue, and then they have peer-reviewed academic journals that yell at each other because one person agrees, one disagrees. Then the provenance trail suggests, could this be the real deal? Does it have enough of a record that suggests that it is old enough, that it is from the right pedigree? And then if that checks out, then the final sort of tiebreaker, if people can't decide, is forensic testing. And that is very bad at saying this is specifically this work by this artist, but it is good at flagging anachronisms, like a pigment that is post-dating the year that the work should have been made. That's an example. So it can say something funny is going on, but it's bad at being very specific and saying this is certainly a Leonardo. But this was tested very thoroughly, and on all 3 counts, it passed the tests, and now it's almost unequivocally considered a work by Leonardo, and it will be the centerpiece of the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. I came to the study of art crime a little bit of a different direction. I was studying art history, iconography of 16th century Florentine painting. This one in particular, which JD's favorite, right? The sound engineer's favorite painting, it's mine as well. And I was interested in art objects as detective stories, as puzzles. And that's how I teach art history. I think of history itself as a giant jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. And each time we find an archival document or an object, it adds a piece of the puzzle. But we still have to make educated guesses about what the rest of the completed puzzle might look like. But I also like objects that are meant to be visual riddles or puzzles to solve. And painting like this, Allegory of Love and Lust by Bronzino, is one of the most famous riddle paintings ever made. And so I approach it as if I'm a detective, and you have to have a certain amount of a priori knowledge when you look at the work in question. But a lot of it is logic, and you try to piece together what the artist intended us to understand. So it was a relatively short step for me to look at true crime involving artworks. And you have the detective work of analyzing the iconography and interpreting the painting. And you have the detective work of actually looking for paintings that are stolen or investigating forgery. And dating back to 2006, I founded a research group called ARCA, the Association for Research into Crimes Against Art, that runs the first postgraduate program in the study of art crime. It's every summer in Italy. If you want to come join us, hang out in Italy, and do a little studying too, you're welcome to. And that was my introduction to the world of art crime. So looking at lost art was a natural next step, because in this book, we look at various ways that art can disappear. And there are lots of them. And the ones that I was most comfortable with initially was theft, war looting, and iconoclasm and vandalism. But those aren't the only ways. Those are the criminally culpable ways that art can be lost. But there are all sorts of ways. And I really want to highlight a couple of things through this book and through the talk tonight. One is the fragility of art and how miraculous it is that so much does survive. We tend to take it for granted, and we walk past objects that it is a small miracle that every one of them has survived the decades, centuries, or millennia. But it's also important to keep in mind that the objects that have survived were not necessarily the most important when they were first made. We have what I call a survivor bias. And that's understandable because it's easiest to study objects that are still extant. And there are a few hundred works in just about every Art History 101 textbook that we study over and over again because we can access them. But that doesn't mean that they were the most important works when the artist created them. And there are examples of works that are lost that people tend to forget about, even though they're by world-famous artists, just because we can't access them, or we only have a description, or we only have copies after them. And it's important not to forget that. So part of this book is sort of a negative space history of art, because I not only want to tell you the fun stories of the dramas and how the works were lost and how many works were miraculously found again, but also why they were important. They're not just good stories, but they show us a deeper and broader and different sort of a shadow history of art that even avid art lovers might not be familiar with. So let me take you through some of the stories this evening. This is one that may have come across this in the media. This is Leonardo's lost fresco called Battle of Anghiari. And this was in the media quite frequently until 2012. We'll get to that in a moment. But what we see here is not the original. This is a copy by Rubens after the lost fresco. And the story is that in 1505, there was an intentional artists' duel in Florence between Michelangelo and Leonardo, the two leading artists of the time. And they were each assigned a wall of this enormous room called the Sala de Cinquecento, which is part of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And you can see how big it is. It's the size of 3 basketball courts. I live in Europe. I still don't really know what a meter is. It's 3,886 meters, but 3 basketball courts is easiest for us to wrap our heads around. And the painting was initially around here, and it was incompleted. If Leonardo were alive today, he would probably be given Ritalin, and he would have had much more of an output than the 15 paintings or so that survive. He was really hyperactive, and he, for example, he wasn't really into painting. It was one of the things he did, but he made most of his money as a musician playing a 6-stringed lute-like instrument called the lira de braccio. So he was like a rock star of classical music, and he sold his services as a military engineer, and oh, by the way, he could paint too if you wanted him to. So this wasn't his priority. He started this, he didn't finish it. Fast forward to 1563, and Giorgio Vasari was asked to redecorate this room. Giorgio Vasari is one of my favorites. Shameless self-promotion, another book of mine, The Collector of Lives, is about Giorgio Vasari and also tells this story, as does Museum of Lost Art. Giorgio Vasari was the first art historian. He published in 1550 the first group biography of artists called Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And this is the source from which we get a lot of information about lost works, because they're works that he describes as having been made by famous artists, and we don't know where they are. And so he gives us clues as to what we might be looking out for. Well, he was a huge fan of Leonardo. He was basically a groupie. And he was also a great painter, a great architect. He designed the Uffizi, which was the offices of the Duchy of Tuscany, now the famous museum in Florence. And he was obliged to redecorate and expand this room and cover it with his own frescoes of famous Medici battle scenes. And he would have been heartbroken to paint over the Leonardo. So just maybe he figured out a way to preserve it and hide it and leave a clue for future generations to uncover. Dramatic pause. I'm going to tell you what happened at the end of the talk, so you got to stick with me for the rest of it. It's important to me not to over-focus on European painting, which I tend to do anyway. I think we all tend to, but try to be expansive and talk about other cultures. And for me, as a specialist in European painting, I needed to flex my wings a little bit to learn about them. And there's some amazing stories that I'd like to guide you through beyond Europe. So this is possibly the most famous katana or samurai sword ever made. It's called the Hanjo Masamune. And Masamune is this fellow here who is the most famous swordsmith in Japan. He died in 1343. And this is a replica of what the blade possibly looked like. The story is that this was a quasi-legendary blade from the moment it was completed. It was wielded by samurai generals, and it gets its name from a general who wielded it in 1595 named General Honjo Shiganaga. And the story is that he was in a single combat fight with another general who had this sword, and the sword chopped his helmet in 2 with a single blow, but that was nothing for Honjo. He managed to defeat the general and take this sword as a prize, and it got his name from that point on. He eventually sold it to the Tokugawa shoguns who led Japan through the Edo period, and the last of the Tokugawa family members had it at the beginning of the Second World War. And in 1939, it was declared one of the national treasures of Japan. So the story gets a little bit fuzzy here. In December 1945, this member of the Tokugawa family brings this and 14 other famous antique blades to a Tokyo district police station, and he hands them over for safekeeping. We're not quite sure why he did this, if he felt obliged to, but that's the story. 1 month later, someone claiming to be an Allied officer with the Foreign Liquidations Commission showed up at the police station and said that he needed to confiscate all 15 blades, and they've never been seen since. The person had to give his name. It was written down as something that sounds like it was probably misheard. It's written down as Sergeant Coldy Bimore. Doesn't sound like a name, right? Maybe it's a mishearing of Cody Billmore, or we don't actually know, but that's the last time that these 15 blades were seen, including this, the most famous one. So they're almost certainly still out there. Why do I say that? Even criminals know that art and objects like this are of incredibly high value, and they're of value when they are intact and as unharmed as possible. So there's no historical precedent for people knowingly destroying works of art, aside from a few outlying examples, but it's not something we anticipate. These are high-value objects, and people understand that they have to remain in good condition to remain high value. So they're almost certainly sitting somewhere, waiting to be found. The only question is when we will stumble upon them. Give you an example again of the scale, particularly if we look back in time. The famous Athenian sculptor Lysippos, according to Pliny, he made 1,500 sculptures during his career. How many of them are extant now? One, the Getty bronze. So keep an eye out for 1,499 ancient Athenian bronzes. Okay, this next slide, this is probably a case study with which you're familiar. This is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, which took place on St. Patrick's Day, 1990, when two people dressed as policemen knocked on the service entrance of the Gardner Museum, and against regulations, the two guards on duty opened the door, let them in, and they were immediately seized and bound and gagged and placed in the basement. And for about 42 minutes, the people pretending to be policemen wandered through the museum, and they picked out objects to steal. And they chose 13 objects. Some of them were very famous, like you see here, of Vermeer's The Concert, Rembrandt's Storm on the Sea of Galilee, Manet's Chez Tortoni. But it was a little bit funny because they left some things on the walls that you'd think they would have wanted to take, like Titian's Rape of Europa, which was arguably the most valuable object in the collection. They also were a combination of brutish and cautious. So they wanted to take a Napoleonic battle flag, but for some reason they didn't break the vitrine to get it out when it was locked. Instead, they took an eagle-shaped fitment that would have sat on top of the flagpole. But on the other hand, they trod upon some paintings what they had trouble getting them out of their frames. So it's a little bit confusing. They disappeared into the night. The objects have never been seen again. This is considered the largest art theft in peacetime history in terms of value. These are worth an estimated $500 million. It's also probably the largest peacetime property theft of any property in history. There's a $5 million reward. Again, if you feel like, chasing some lost art, this is a good option. What's happened to them? Well, there's lots of theories. There are numerous detectives chasing these objects on their own time, hoping for the reward, and this is really the holy grail for lost art. If you can find this, that is the biggest fish. But we don't know where they are now. The FBI is stuck. The best information at the moment is the people who know where the objects are all deceased. And so at this point, it's a question of probably just stumbling on them by accident at some point. They're almost certainly protected in some sort of case, hopefully in a relatively stable environment without too much humidity. But it's a matter of luck now at this point if we're going to find them, unless there's someone still alive who hasn't come forward who knows about them. And just last year, they raised the reward from $5 million to $10 million. Didn't shake up anything, so it's probable that the people who know where they are no longer with us. I could spend the next 2 hours talking about this painting. Should we do that? No, okay. This is another obsession of mine. This is called Adoration of the Mystic Lamb by Hubert van Eyck. It is easy for me to argue that it's the single most important painting ever made. It's certainly the most frequently stolen. It's been stolen, it's been stolen all or in part 6 different times. And the Guinness Book of World Records has the wrong information. They say that the most frequently stolen painting is a Rembrandt portrait of Jacob de Geen, which is at the Dulwich Picture Gallery. That's only been stolen 4 times. So we blow that out of the water. It's also been the object of anything bad that can happen to a work of art. There are 13 different bad things, including crimes, that happened to this work of art over its 600-year lifespan since it was finished in 1432. From a painting perspective, this was the first major oil painting that showed the capabilities of the medium. It's not the first oil painting, that's a popular misconception, but this is the one that really stretched the possibilities of this new medium of oil, and it was a pilgrimage point for every artist who had a chance to pass through Ghent and would come and see it. It's got a very complex Catholic iconography, and this is why it was very nearly destroyed in 1560. 1560, there were a series of Calvinist riots trying to overthrow the Catholic Habsburg leaders of the community. It always sounds funny to me to think of Calvinists rioting, because I don't think of that's what they're into, but at the time they were. And there was one evening in April when the rioters outside were trying to get into the cathedral, but it was locked from the inside. And the rioters didn't have a battering ram to break in. But a group of Catholic soldiers were standing very nervously inside the cathedral that night, prepared to defend this painting with their lives and being hopelessly outnumbered by the rioters. And I find this very moving when people are willing to give up their lives to save art. We hear about that story throughout the history of art. In 1734, on Christmas Eve, at the Alcazar in Madrid, there was a huge fire that destroyed hundreds of paintings. It destroyed the Alcazar Palace. It destroyed the expulsion of the Moors by Diego Velázquez. And it very nearly destroyed Las Meninas, which many people think is the greatest painting ever made. And people ran back into the conflagration and threw works of art out the windows at risk to themselves, including Las Meninas, and that sort of act of bravery. It's understandable if you do that for a person, but if you do that because you love the art so much, that's a very moving thing to me. We hear about that with the monuments men in the Second World War, and these punctuation marks through history. I find that very personally moving. So that night, this group of soldiers was hoping that the rioters didn't get in, and indeed they didn't, but they knew that they would be back in the near future. So the next night, the Calvinist rioters returned, and this time they had a tree trunk strapped with rope so they could swing it like a battering ram, and they slammed it repeatedly against the giant oak door to the cathedral, and it splintered open, and they poured in, and you can imagine their torches with the light flickering against the interior of the cathedral at night, and they rushed to the Jostveit chapel to grab this painting and drag it out into the square to set fire to it, but it was gone. And in the heat of that moment, they didn't have the wherewithal to check as closely as they might. They took everything that was made out of wood out of the cathedral and burned it in a bonfire outside, but they didn't think to look in the one place where it was hidden. The soldiers had dismantled it into its 12 constituent panels and hid it at the top of a bell tower. And they locked the door and hoped nobody would think to look there, and were waiting very nervously on the spiral staircase leading up to the bell tower. In fact, no one did think to look there, and the next morning the Catholics regained control, and this was moved to a fortified facility. But it was very nearly destroyed. Why? Well, now we get to one of the chapter studies on iconoclasm and vandalism. Vandalism is the damage or destruction or defacing of property when there is no symbolic rationale to what you choose to deface. So you spray like Noah was here on a random wall, and that's vandalism. Iconoclasm, from the Greek word ikon, meaning symbol, is when the object chosen for defacement has a symbolic rationale for choosing it. So why were the Calvinist rioters after this? Well, this was representative of Catholicism, which they objected to. And they couldn't literally destroy Catholicism because it's an idea, but they could destroy its manifestations. And that's what we see also even today with ISIS defacing non-Islamic art and destroying it, the Bamiyan Buddhas with the Taliban in 2004 being detonated. It continues. It's always been a part of our history, unfortunately. But this, to me, is far more upsetting. Ask any specialist. We would much rather have art stolen than destroyed, because stolen art almost inevitably eventually resurfaces. It might take generations, but it does. And it's still cared for. It still exists. Art is destroyed, there's nothing we can do about it. So it's much more upsetting. This was very nearly destroyed. What was destroyed and what ruins the historical record is there was an ornate framework to this altarpiece that they were unable to disassemble, and it was still in the Jostveit chapel, and that was burned. And that had inscriptions on it and decorations carved that somehow dealt with and resonated with the content of the painting, and we don't know what it looked like, unfortunately, so parts of it were damaged. Now, 11/12 of this painting still is extant. This panel is missing. This is referred to as the Righteous Judges panel, and there is a crazy art heist story when it was stolen in 1934. It's very comical and weird, but the punchline, because we've got to get to other case studies, sorry guys. The punchline is this is still missing, and this is still very much part of the cultural oxygen of the people of Ghent and of Belgium. There are hundreds of leads submitted to the police or the bishopric every year, and dozens of them are followed up, and nobody knows where this is. So this is an important case study. This is a replacement panel painted during the Second World War by a guy called Jef van der Wecken. Jef van der Wecken features in my last book for Phaidon, The Art of Forgery. He was the most famous conservator in Belgium at the time, but he was also an art forger. He forged works by Hans Memling that he tricked Hermann Göring, the second in command of the Nazis, into buying. And when Göring fled at the end of the Second World War, he took 7 paintings with him, his favorite ones, and one of them was the Memling by Jef van der Wecken. In 2004, there was an exhibit called Fake or Not Fake about van der Wecken's conservation, not about his forgeries, because he was a little too enthusiastic with the paintbrush, and there was more van der Wecken than Van Eyck in the works that he conserved. So he's another character, and this is by him, and there's too many more mysteries to give you, but suffice to say, this is you can imagine a whole world of art crime and all the bad things that can happen to a very important work of art in this one. This is an important painting for the history of art crime. This is Caravaggio's Palermo Nativity, stolen from the Church of San Lorenzo in Palermo in 1969. 1969 was a year when the Italian government was trying to crack down on mafia activity, and it was stolen by members of Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia. And that theft prompted the establishment of the world's first stolen art detectives with a police agency. This is with the Carabinieri, which is the Italian military police. It's called Tutela Patrimonio Culturale, or TPC division, and now it is by far the largest and most successful art police in the world, with over 300 full-time agents. And they have a database of stolen art called Leonardo that has over 4 million stolen objects in it. And that was begun because this was stolen. What happened to it? Well, we know that Cosa Nostra was behind it. There's a British journalist who went undercover helping the Carabinieri, pretending to be a criminal art collector. Now, I should pause here and say that the cliches about art theft are primarily from the realm of fiction and film. Historically, we know of almost no one who proactively bought stolen art or commissioned thieves to steal art or stole art regularly. So this Thomas Crown or Dr. No figure is primarily of the realm of fiction. What happens much more often is art is stolen by members of organized crime groups, and it is subsumed into a closed black market for other illicit goods. The US Department of Justice a few years back declared that art crime was the 3rd highest grossing criminal trade worldwide, behind only the drug and arms trades. And we know of cases where art was stolen and used either for collateral in a deal with other criminal groups or in a barter system, swapped for drugs or for arms, essentially swapping things that are of high value and for which there's a risk in trying to cash in on them. And it's like if you have a check and you might get arrested if you try to cash the check. You think you probably could cash it if you really wanted to, but as long as you don't and you agree that this little piece of paper is worth X amount of money, then you can swap it for other illicit goods for which there's a risk in trying to cash in on them, and then you never actually have to do a cash deal and you minimize the risk. So this is what happens with most stolen art, stolen from extant collections. The far bigger problem, and the reason that the scale of stolen art is so big, is illicit trade in antiquities. Antiquities are taken directly out of the earth or sometimes the sea, and they've never existed before for modern humans. We don't know what to look for. They will never appear on a stolen art registry because they were literally taken out of the earth when they were buried, 2,000 years ago. And these objects can be sold on an open market with only fake provenance, so paperwork suggesting they were legitimately exported and excavated. And it's very difficult to police. And in terms of scale and in terms of selling for full value, this is by far the biggest problem in the world of art crime. And of course, since 2015, it's been overtly clear that terrorist groups like ISIS get significant funding through selling looted antiquities. So it's a very serious problem indeed. Well, most of the stolen art that is recovered is stolen through police sting operations. And there's a benefit to knowing that there are almost no criminal art collectors out there, because criminals watch the same movies and read the same novels that we do, and they think that there are criminal art collectors out there. And they, with some regularity, fall for police disguised as criminal art collectors. And one of them is a colleague through ARCA. His name's Charlie Hill. If you read The Rescue Artist, which was a best-selling book a little while back, a couple years ago, it's about him. And he used to say that he would disguise himself in the most flamboyant possible way. Okay, close your eyes and imagine a criminally intrigued art collector. And he's got like a pink bow tie and a monocle and a top hat and a cane. He looks like the Planters peanut guy, right? And this is what he would dress as. And the criminals would steal art, because unfortunately it's not as hard to steal art as we might like. It is very hard to steal art from a museum like this. Not recommended, but from private collections, from churches, from small galleries, it's unfortunately not so hard, but it's very hard to turn it into cash. And so the criminals would steal it, assuming they're going to find a Dr. No type who they're going to be able to sell it to. Dr. No is the villain in the very first James Bond movie who had his hideout full of stolen art and also an elevator that dropped you into a shark tank, if we remember this movie. Okay. They think they're going to find someone like that, and they get desperate when they don't. And then they see on the horizon somebody who looks like the Planters peanut guy, and they get really excited because they think that this is the person they've been waiting for, and it turns out to be Charlie Hill in disguise. So that's how most of the big name recoveries have been made, that and a little bit of good luck. Well, hoping for a recovery like that, a British journalist went undercover with the Carabinieri, and he understood that they had the Caravaggio. He was not offered it, but he was offered to buy a Bronzino and an Andrea del Sarto painting, and he recovered both of them in a sting operation, and now they're on the walls of the Accademia Gallery in Florence. A mafia penitento, someone who is a mafia informant, said that this painting was still in Sicily. It was damaged really badly in an earthquake, and they didn't know what to do with it, and to hide the evidence, they fed it to pigs. But let's hope not. And hope springs eternal that this is on, some little old mafia grandmother's wall, which would be a much better option. This is a personal story for me. You may recognize this gentleman if you're interested in contemporary art. This is the famous living performance artist Ulay. And this was a performance of his in 1976. In 1976, as what he calls in German an Aktion, which means action, but it's actually more like a political demonstration or an action that has a political resonance. And he decided he was going to steal this painting from the new museum in Berlin. This is The Poor Poet by Karl Spitzweg. And this is not a great painting. It's a little bit cheesy, but it has the dubious distinction of having been Hitler's very favorite painting. And that's why he chose it. And here you see him. This photograph was taken by his then partner, Marina Abramovic. There was also a film made of the whole adventure. And he decided to steal this work of art and bring it to the home of a poor immigrant Turkish family and hang it on their wall. And I'll tell you the trick he used. When I was giving a talk a couple days ago, I said to the security guards who were in the room that I'm going to tell them how some criminals famously stole art so that I'm not going to be fooled by the same trick again. So I'll give you a little clue. He wanted to lure the guards away from the side of the room on which the painting was held. And so he was trying to figure out how to do this. And he hadn't pre-planned this. He's not a great criminal mastermind. So he went to the opposite side of the room, and he looked at a painting. He started giggling hysterically. And the security guards came over and thought he's like weird or he needs help or something. And as soon as they came over, he sprinted to the other side of the room. He pulled out a wire cutter that he had in his pocket, and he clipped the wire that was hanging the painting to the wall. And he knew when he did that, an alarm would go off, and all the doors would automatically lock. But he also knew that due to fire regulations, the fire escape would not lock. And the guards didn't think of this. And so he sprinted out the fire escape, and there was snow on the ground. It was very cinematic. He slipped on the snow and nearly fell over, and the guards shouted, "Now we've got him," and they almost tackled him. And then he made it to this van of his that was idling outside, and he made his escape. And he brought it to the home of this family. He hung it on the wall, and then he called the museum and turned himself in and said where he was located. And then he very nervously was chain smoking outside because he assumed he would be arrested and in big trouble. When the director of the museum realized that he wasn't doing this with criminal intent, he sort of sided with him. He wound up getting off with probation. The object was returned. Why is it lost art? In 1989, it was stolen, seemingly not as a performance art piece because it's never been seen again. But he didn't do it. He's one of my buddies. He's also married to a Slovenian woman and lives in Slovenia. If you get a chance to marry a Slovenian, I recommend it. All the finest people do. So this is one of these stories that has a personal resonance because I interviewed him for an article in the Guardian newspaper a couple years ago, and we became friends, and he's a really lovely guy. And so I got the inside scoop of this story of lost art. Let's go back a bit further in time. I could have a whole talk about the 7 wonders of the ancient world because I think it's a really fascinating subject, and 6 of them are lost. The one that's not lost is the Great Pyramid at Giza. The other 6 are considered lost, but there's a small possibility that one of them has recently been found again. So the one I'm showing you here this is an artist's reproduction of what the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have looked like. And the story is that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built by King Nebuchadnezzar II, whose wife was from a leafier region and was missing the leafiness. Come up with a better way to explain that, but there you are. And this garden was built, and it was supposed to be the most spectacular garden in the world. And apparently most Babylonian towns and cities had a garden facility, but this was extra magnificent, and it was a terraced garden. Well, there's some problems with this concept because, one, there's never been an archaeological discovery that suggests the remnants of a garden in ancient Babylon. And there are also some historical sources which don't refer to a famous garden, but describe Babylon in much detail, like Herodotus. And that's a little bit funny because if he's describing the city, and this is one of the wonders of the ancient world, you'd think he would include it. Well, a few years ago, ISIS blew up parts of Mosul. And Mosul is across the river from ancient Nineveh. And when they blew it up, they inadvertently revealed some archaeological ruins that nobody knew about because there were structures built on top of it. And archaeologists have analyzed what was found, and there's 50 kilometers worth of aqueducts, canals, waterways, and even a water screw which allows you to bring water uphill to irrigate a massive garden, which no one had known had existed in Nineveh, but the archaeological ruins that suggest it may have been a massive garden that better matches historical descriptions of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon than anything that was found in Babylon. And there's a historical rationale for this. King Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, who built up Nineveh at the time that these ruins were revealed, he had repressed Babylon because they had been repeatedly rising up in revolt against the Assyrian Empire, and he may have destroyed their hanging gardens and swiped the idea for it, or maybe even pieces of it, and brought it to Nineveh to build up. So the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may never have been in Babylon, or they may have been there and been transposed to Nineveh, and ISIS's attempts at iconoclasm, at destroying art, may have actually revealed a formerly lost wonder of the world. It's sexy time, people. I hope that's okay. In the 1520s, a very famous printmaker named Marcantonio Raimondi got the idea to make a series of erotic prints. This is the first work of printed pornography. It's called I Modi, or the Positions, or the 16 Pleasures. And there were 16 erotic prints that he printed up. Now, if you've heard of Raimondi, there's 2 reasons why you may have heard of him and why I can say with assurance that this is art, and in addition to other things. One is that he was Raphael's official printmaker, and the reason that Raphael was among the most famous artists in Italy, or rather throughout Europe in the 15 teens, is because of Raimondi's prints after Raphael's paintings. Raphael was famous in countries and among people who had never seen any of his paintings, because his paintings were in Urbino and Rome primarily, but they had seen these prints after him. But Raimondi was also naughty for not just these reasons, and he was the subject of what was probably the very first intellectual property lawsuit involving art. In 1506, he was sued by Albrecht Dürer in Venice for having made forgeries of Dürer woodcut engravings, which were sold at a print shop run by the Dal-Jesus family as Dürer originals. And they were not mechanical copies. The plates were hand-carved by Raimondi. This requires immense skill. But they included Dürer's famous A.D. trademark, which was a mark of authenticity that was by Dürer. But they also had 3 differences from the Dürer originals that if you looked really closely you could find. So it was a little bit of a complicated case. In the end, Dürer sort of had a halfway victory. The Dal-Jesus family could no longer sell these Raimondi copies after Dürer as Dürer originals, but they could sell them as copies after. And the tribunal said Dürer should really be quite complimented that somebody thought he was good enough to warrant copying his work. So it wasn't the huge moral victory he'd hoped for. But Raimondi was also up to this naughty business. And Pope Clement VII wasn't finding this amusing at all, and he tried to confiscate all of the first print run and burn them. But a very famous and, for me, intriguing character named Pietro Aretino commissioned a second printing series. Now, Pietro Aretino, if you're going to go for a beer with anybody from the Renaissance, this is the guy you want to go with. Aretino was Titian's best friend. They used to have huge drunken parties at their house in Venice. And to give you a sense of Aretino's personality, I'll tell you how he died. He's supposedly, well, he was maybe one of the first people who was famous for being famous and witty, not for what he created. We have a lot of people these days who are famous for being famous and they don't really make anything that rationalizes the fame. Well, he's a proto-example of that. He wrote 16 sonnets, 1 sonnet to accompany each of the sexual positions. And at the end of his life, the story is that he died from having a stroke from laughing too hard at a dirty joke made at the expense of his sister. So this is a guy who knew how to party. And he wanted to have a second print run, and he wrote these poems to accompany them. Well, in 1527, they were published. And Pope Clement VII tried to have all of them suppressed as well. But hope springs eternal that some of them were not destroyed because the Pope had other problems in 1527. If we know any of our Roman history, that's the year that Rome was sacked by the mutinous soldiers of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The Pope had to retreat to Castle Sant'Angelo, where he was essentially a prisoner there. They couldn't get in, but he couldn't get out. For a long time, he had to sneak out, disguised as a gardener, eventually. So he had other things on his mind than repressing art/pornography, so maybe some of it survived. Well, pirated editions certainly did. This is at the British Museum. This is probably from one of the pirated editions. In fact, one of the earliest publications from Oxford University Press was 2 dons at Oxford thought it would be great fun to translate Aretino's sonnets and come up with the first English edition called Aretino's Postures, and with the naughty pictures involved as well. And they were printing them out until the fuddy-duddy dean of Oxford shut down the operation. And I'll give you one more case study that will take us now to China before we finish up. So in 1860, in the midst of the Opium Wars, there was a sacking of the Old Summer Palace in Beijing by both British and French troops. And this was an enormous palace complex with many palaces involved in it. But one of the most famous things there was called the Zodiac Water Clock. And it was decorated with 12 bronze heads of animals associated with the Chinese zodiac. Now, this is not them. This is actually a new artwork by Ai Weiwei that he made just a few years ago and which sold. And this is an homage to that story. He recreated what he imagined they would all look like. But the image I showed you before were 2 heads, a rat and a rabbit. And these were lost works of art until 2009, when the auction of the estate of Yves Saint Laurent, the fashion designer, went on sale. And no one had seen these objects since, and they didn't know Yves Saint Laurent didn't know their origin. And when they were sold at Christie's, they were bought by a Chinese buyer who refused to pay for them afterwards as a protest. They were eventually returned to China, and now 7 of the 12 are in Chinese museums, which means that the rest are still out there. So if you see, for instance, something that looks like this on somebody's shelf, call up the Chinese embassy. Going to come back to that opening story to tell you the punchline of it. Here we have Giorgio Vasari, and here you see on Vasari's own fresco, you see we have this close-up here. In this entire frescoed room, full of hundreds of figures, the size of 3 basketball courts, there are only 2 words painted: cerca, trova, seek and you will find. And it seems to be a real-life Da Vinci Code treasure hunt that Vasari set up for us back in 1563. Nobody noticed this until 1975. And that year, an Italian scholar noted it. One of his protégés, a guy named Maurizio Serracini, who's an engineer, was brought in by the Italian government to investigate. And they used high-tech equipment to look behind the wall. They also drilled through the Vasari fresco at 6 points. They chose very carefully points where they were sure that Vasari had not actually applied paint. They chose more background or uninteresting places to drill, but it was drilled by conservators from the Ministry of Culture. And they found that just where they suspected there was a gap of several centimeters between the Vasari fresco, which was a false wall, and the back wall behind it. So it is very likely that the Leonardo fresco is behind there. They also used a surgical probe to go through the holes and take pigment samples, and the pigment samples could have come from the sort that Leonardo used, so it's entirely possible. It's in fact probable that it's back there. One of the reasons we know that this is a strong possibility is thanks to this painting. Giorgio Vasari liked a good treasure hunt, like all of us do. And he was asked to renovate the church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And when he writes about it, he says he was obliged to do so. He definitely didn't want to. He thought it was beautiful as is. And one of the reasons he didn't want to renovate it is that this famous fresco would have to be destroyed in order to renovate it. This is Masaccio's Holy Trinity, and this is on any art historian's list of the 10 most important and influential paintings. This is essentially the painting that first illustrated single vanishing point perspective and then became a point of pilgrimage for any artist who was studying art and wound up in Florence. This is hugely influential, and its survival was up to Vasari. And Vasari turned out to have moved it to a different wall and bricked it over. But we had no written record of this, and it's funny because he wrote so much. We have hundreds of letters from him, and we have, of course, his book, The Lives of the Artists. But there was no written record of it, and people assumed that this was a lost work of art until 1860, when they were renovating, and they discovered one of the most important paintings in history that had been protected hundreds of years earlier thanks to Vasari's ingenuity. So there was a precedent set for building a false wall to protect a work of art that he admired when he had to renovate the space. So it's almost certain that Leonardo's Battle of Anghiari is behind that wall. Why haven't we found it? You may have heard of Italian bureaucracy, which is famously labyrinthine, and in 2012, operations were halted, and they haven't continued since then. So at some point, presumably, it will be revealed, but there hasn't been yet. And then I think I will just end telling you what this is. If there's one lost work of art that would be amazing to find, it's this one. This is also one of Vasari's. It was called the Libro dei Disegni, or the Book of Drawings. Before we had the concept of museums that we do today, we had the writings and thoughts of Vasari, and what Vasari thought of in terms of the history of art, who was important, how museums should be displayed and curated. That's largely what we think today. It's based on his writings. And he came up with the idea of a portable museum. He had 12 large folio volume blank books, and he proactively collected drawings by artists. He was the first person to collect drawings. Prior to him, Drawings were thought of more like blueprints. You keep the house, but you don't necessarily keep the blueprints. But he thought that the drawings had value. And he filled 12 large folio books with drawings by all of the artists he admired, many of whom he knew. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. There's a story of Michelangelo shoveling his drawings into a fire towards the end of his life, trying to erase the trail of how hard he worked to come up with his concepts. There's an Italian idea called sprezzatura, which basically means you got to show that everything is easy for you. Don't sweat it. Everything comes easily. And he was trying to destroy that. And if you can imagine it, when I was a student, I worked at Christie's one summer, and they sold a single page Michelangelo drawing for 13 million pounds. So he is shoveling 13 million pounds worth of drawings into an oven. And Vasari is the one we have to thank for the fact that these were preserved. But his 12 books are lost. They're individual pages that survive, like this one, which is in the Uffizi. And what's even cooler is Vasari did drawings in the style of the artists whose drawing was featured on that page in the margins around it. So it was like a portable museum before the concept of museum existed. So if I could find one lost work, I think this would be pretty cool. But unfortunately, well, maybe it's in somebody's living room. You never know. You got to keep your eyes peeled for that. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. And I'm very happy to answer questions. I'm going to start out from the simulcast room. This is hugely exciting that there's so many people interested that we have a second room running. So I'm going to start with their question. And meanwhile, we'll take questions here too. What is the recovery rate of stolen art? This is a very good question. There have been a number of studies done. The research organization that I founded, ARCA, tries to coordinate the relatively few people around the world who do focus on this, whether it's from a policing side or scholarship. And one of the articles that we published in our peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Art Crime, suggested that the recovery rate plus successful prosecution is 1.5%. We are very bad at recovering stolen art. We are very bad at prosecuting people, and we're even worse at doing both. We know relatively little about art crime because we haven't prosecuted enough cases. We know the most about things that have gone to trial, where we've arrested the perpetrators, recovered the objects, and then over the course of the trial, information comes out. One of the reasons that art crime is a relatively new field of study is that criminologists get nervous unless they have reams of data. Whereas I approach it from an art historical perspective where we have like 3 little things and you have to work from almost nothing, from anecdotal history, and try to build backwards from it. So I wasn't burdened by this need to have reams of data and statistics to draw on. So you have to start somewhere. And this started very slowly with studies of a few dozen thefts, and then a few hundred, and then a few thousand. But the recovery rates are pretty abysmal. The best by far are the Carabinieri. They claim a recovery rate of 30% of what is reported to them. But it's somewhere like 6 to 10% is probably about right. So not that I'm recommending you get into this line of business. It's very hard to turn stolen art into cash, but unfortunately, we're not particularly good at recovering it. We should take a question in the room. Okay?
The Amber Room in Catherine's Palace outside St. Petersburg. How did a whole room go and disappear? And is any effort being made to recover it today?
That's a great question, and that is one of the subjects in this book. So the Amber Room was a series of rooms. I say series because it was originally made with amber panels, and then it expanded, and it expanded again and again with each subsequent owner. And it became really the status symbol of the Russian aristocracy and royalty. And it disappeared, and this is one of the ones where we hope it still survives. But the way it disappeared is this. Prior to the Second World War, right at the beginning of it, it was in the Catherine Palace, and the Nazis were encroaching on the location, and the custodians of the palace couldn't dismantle the room in time and move it out. So what they did is create a false wall throughout the room to try to hide the fact that the room was lined with amber panels. But they were using muslin and curtains, and it didn't really fool anybody. The Nazis knew exactly what they were after, and they dismantled it and brought it to a place called Königsberg, where it was installed in a castle waiting for the end of the war. What was awaiting for the end of the war? Well, Hitler had a plan to create a super museum and turn the entire city of Linz, Austria into a citywide museum that would have every important artwork in the world. And the last third of my book about the Ghent altarpiece is one of the many stories of the Monuments Men and the attempts of two Monuments Men in particular to race against an SS division that was bent on destroying all of the 7,000 most important works looted from Europe that were kept in a secret underground salt mine in Altaussee near Salzburg. And this room probably would have been destined either for the Linz Super Museum, or there was a rivalry between Hermann Göring and Hitler racing each other to steal art that had been stolen by the ERR, the Nazi art theft unit, for their own collections. And there were about 7,000 objects in Hermann Göring's private collection of stolen art. So it probably would have ended up as a trophy for one of them. The problem is that there was an Allied bomb dropped on the castle that held the Amber Room, and it was probably completely destroyed at the time. I say probably because we don't know. And there are always these slices of hope that the object or parts of it survived. It also was expanding. Various owners added more amber to expand the size of the room into more and more panels. So it's possible that some of the panels were saved, possibly while it was still in Russia, or maybe before the Allied bombs dropped on Königsberg. So hope springs eternal. And why can we hope that some of the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lost artworks might resurface? Well, not long ago, in an apartment in Augsburg near Munich, the apartment of Cornelius Gurlitt was raided by police because he was in trouble for tax evasion. And to their surprise, they found 1,406 lost paintings in one apartment. And that's certainly just the tip of the iceberg. But it requires an element of luck at a certain point to stumble across things. Who's got another question for me? Yes, sir.
I've done some reading of the subject, and one of the things that stands out is that there are certain collectors who will pay certain art thieves to steal certain specific works of art, and they have these underground museums, like a room or a cellar with, let's say, 10 paintings that they covet, and those paintings stay with them indefinitely. Do you know anything about that?
That is a popular misconception that isn't true, so I'm happy to quash that. That is almost exclusively the realm of fiction and film. I can tell you a few stories of true examples, but that's what criminals think. And the fact that they're unable to find people like that, and that they fall for Charlie Hill dressed as the Planters Peanut guy, tells us that those people don't exist. Almost certainly there have been people like that, and perhaps there were in the past, but criminals can't seem to find them. And what are some real-life examples? Well, I'll give you one really good real-life example of a criminal art collector. His name was Pablo Picasso. Picasso, we have documented records, stole from the Louvre Museum himself and also commissioned the theft from a Belgian con man who worked as Apollinaire, his best friend's secretary, for a short amount of time. And he commissioned the theft of some Iberian statue heads that he had admired on the Louvre Museum. And those Iberian statue heads, his lover, Fernand Olivier at the time, mentioned that it was weird that he kept all of his art out in the studio or in the house, except for these statues, which he kept in his sock drawer. And she thought this was a little bit funny. Well, both Apollinaire and Picasso were brought in for questioning when the Mona Lisa was stolen in 1911. They didn't have anything to do with the Mona Lisa theft, but they were terrified because they had stolen other art from the Louvre. And this story is told in a book that I was delighted to see that you guys have in the bookstore. It's called The Thefts of the Mona Lisa. This was published by ARCA as a fundraiser for our nonprofit. And it's a little bit esoteric for my books, but they have the story, and there's a whole chapter about this story. And this was very influential theft to the history of art because the very first modernist painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907, features the faces of the women in the painting are based on these stolen Iberian statues from this, what's called the Affaire des Statuettes. But important to keep in mind, this idea of the criminal collector with an underground museum has only happened about, I think, 24 times that we know of in history, and there are tens of thousands of art thefts every year. So in terms of its importance and its actuality, you can basically set it aside. It really doesn't happen except for a very few exceptions. Yes, sir.
Hi. Were you aware that the Salvator Mundi by Leonardo was in this museum?
I was not. That's very cool. When was it here?
Probably 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
And we were trying to buy it, and it was in the basement of this museum and shown to potential donors. We were trying to buy it for like $75 million.
That would have been a good deal, yeah. But they didn't go for it, I guess.
No, not
Was
yet.
it because at the time they weren't certain of the authenticity, or was there another reason?
No, I think that the donors who were interested in doing it believed in the authenticity, but we just couldn't get enough money
Fair enough, yeah.
to do it. And it was like, we have so many other needs. Do we really want to pour that kind of money?
It is a
into one
chunk of
painting?
change.
Yeah.
But good, you could have spun it for $450 million a couple years later.
I don't know. The DS session policy may not cover that.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, hello. I was curious about the process of many artists who overpaint or repaint over their own works. Specifically, you mentioned Picasso, of course, and we have found many of those, and how that plays into your search process.
This is a great question. It's also featured in the book. There is a tradition of artists reusing supports, and especially older artists in earlier periods when the supports were very expensive. So trying to get full value out of them using all pieces of a piece of paper, both sides of it. And we also have people updating their styles and painting over works that they just didn't like anymore. Doesn't mean that they weren't good, but the style was outdated. So the example that I give in the book is Kazimir Malevich's Black Square, which is one of his most iconic works of suprematism minimalist style. It's literally a black square. And conservators found, using special light spectra that allow them to see underneath the surface of the paint, much like a doctor can use an X-ray to see underneath the skin, they found not one but two lost paintings that he had painted over in very different styles. And this is interesting because it shows the evolution of the style of the artist. He didn't like the previous two styles. He was merely reusing the canvas, and he was happy with the final result. But sometimes you can get almost spooky revelations. There's a term, pentimento, which means sort of the ghosting of an underdrawing or underpainting that you can suddenly see through the surface when light has eroded the top layers of paint. And sometimes it happens almost overnight. You do a double take and suddenly you see a figure in a painting that wasn't there before. And so this is something that can be really interesting for scholars. It can be a little bit creepy for the public, but it's very useful to be able to excavate underneath layers of paintings and see what lies beneath. And it's very powerful that we have these tools like infrared spectroscopy and ultraviolet light and X-rays to see beneath the surface without damaging it and to be able to see what lies beneath. So it's quite frequent, and you can find discoveries in that manner. I'll take another one from the other room maybe quickly. What is the relationship between the art historian and law enforcement agencies who work to recover stolen art? That's a very good question. That is basically what the organization I founded, ARCA, tried to do, to act as a bridge between scholars, security specialists, police, and the relatively few people around the world who focus on art crime. In general, there isn't much mixing. There are occasional questions about whether there's a historical precedent for a currently open case. But essentially, the police don't have the time or the training to look historically or across national boundaries to say, okay, is there some historical event that might lend or suggestion to solving a current case? They need to solve cases, arrest bad guys, recover things. And so they essentially don't have time for the research side of it and the academic side of it. And the criminological theory is more interesting than useful in most cases for them. So most of the time, people like me are essentially listening to stories of people in the field and trying to put it into an overall context. I'm primarily a historian, so I'm looking at the history of art crime. And there are colleagues who focus on the criminology side and looking at theoretical constructs. But I'll give you an example of how this can be useful. In the Art of Forgery book, my previous book with Phaidon, I found that the vast majority of forgers that we know of fit a very specific psychological profile. When I first started studying this, back when I was a graduate student in 2006, my initial hypothesis was maybe art thieves also fit a certain profile. I found that is not the case, but forgers absolutely do. More than 90% of them fit a very narrow psychological profile, which makes it then, if we know that, easier for police to know what sort of person to investigate. So that's the example. If we looked at, for that book, I looked at 120 case studies, of which 60 made it into the book, and out of all of them, almost every person there fit the same very narrow profile. And then that's when it's useful. You take 120 essentially anecdotes of history, and you look for consistencies, and then it becomes criminological theory. Yes, ma'am.
Are there many cases of forgers themselves stealing paintings?
That is also a good question. No, there are not many cases. There are a few that come to mind. There is a painting that was at the National Gallery in Venezuela that was its most famous painting. And it was supposedly by Matisse, and it was found just a few years ago that it was in fact a forgery, and the original had disappeared. So there are some cases where a forgery is swapped in for the stolen original. That doesn't happen very often. There's some almost silly cases. There was a museum in Poland with a Monet painting, and it was stolen and swapped for a poster of the Monet painting that they had brought at the gift shop. But it took the guards 2 days to notice. So that didn't require so much skill. It happens very occasionally, and it makes for a good story, but not all that often. Maybe one more question? Yes, sir.
Obviously, you've seen lots of art. Which artist should we look at that should be in the first rank, but nobody knows about? That is lost art.
Wow,
too.
what a great question. I like that. That's, of course, very subjective, but I love being very subjective. I'm going to say somebody who is not quite in the first rank in general consideration, but I think should be. I love Bronzino. And not just The Sound Engineer and I, but Bronzino's Allegory of Love and Lust is in most art history 101 books because it's a puzzle painting, but people tend to overlook his work. I also am a big fan of Vasari, who gets made fun of a lot. Vasari is not probably top drawer, and he knew that, but he liked to write about the artists who were top drawer, and he liked to promote the style of art that he was working on, mannerism, which was based on people who admired Michelangelo. But I think that he's one of the greats in terms of architecture rather than painting, and we tend to forget about his architecture. The Uffizi is an absolutely amazing building. We get so absorbed by what's on the walls that we tend to forget about the building itself. I should come up with a list because I've never been asked that question. Usually there's like 5 questions that everybody asks me, and I always have to pretend that no one's ever asked me before. But that's no one's ever asked me before, so I have to get back to you on it. Very good question. Thank you so much for your hospitality. And I'd be very happy to say hi in the lobby outside.